Good morning.
Good morning. A couple of things folks will notice. First off, obviously we're not in garb today. We decided that this is a really unpleasant topic. And so we are going to not, I don't know. It didn't seem like something that was a garb moment, right? Like we're not talking about the fun side of all this study, right? We're talking about kind of the shitty side of it. So
shitty side and the more modern aspects of it and why it's extra shitty. So that's why and I think you just need to show your entire shirt there.
Yeah, so the shirt says nachos, not Nazis. It's from a podcast called Behind the Bastards, which I completely recommend. It's a lot of fun to listen to. And in all things, I prefer nachos, not Nazis. So every so often people see this shirt and they're like, nachos, that's awesome. And then they read the other half and they're like, yeah, that's also awesome. I like it. Tech issues are resolved. Tech issues, we're all good. So today's topic, if you missed the title card, is the intersection. It's been given a number of different names, right? The shitty side of studying late Iron Age Scandinavia and early medieval Northern European history. Also, Saga Saturday says punch Nazis, which, on the one hand, we are not advocating violence. On the other hand, if there was somebody to advocate violence against,
right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, my kind of working subtitle in my head was, Nazis bad, Antifa good. So,
So because it's always important to have these kind of conversations starting from a place where everybody is working with the same terms, we wanted to start with some definitions. The first one, these were initially in alphabetical order. They still are.
They still are. I'm like, we didn't change that.
I get a little tetchy, right? Like I need things to be in alphabetical order. It makes me feel better.
I understand completely.
So Aryan.
It still bothers me that OCD is not CDO.
Right. So the first term to define is Aryan. Obviously, this word's going to get used a lot. Not because we're like, let's talk about Aryans, but because all these other people were like, right. But so here's the thing. This is starting off. Things that piss Claire off. There's going to be a lot of those today.
Oh, we might as well this is this.
So the word Aryan is directly related to the word Iran. Why? Because it was an ethnocultural self-designation, and the word specifically was Arya, right? Which I don't know if George R. R. Martin was looking at that when he named his characters, or he just came up with a fun name for a character.
I have not put that together. I think he probably, I wouldn't.
Who knows, right?
Who knows? I can't ascribe thought to anybody.
So it's an ethnocultural self-designation and only attested to among ancient Indo-Iranian people. The idea of being an Aryan was a religious, cultural, linguistic sort of idea, right? It's not a racial idea. It's you belong to this religious group, you belong to this linguistic group, you belong to this cultural group. And this, go ahead.
No, as I say, can I also put in there that that is kind of also the thought behind a Jewish people. Jew is not a race. It is a religious, cultural, ethno group, right? It's not. Right. So I just find it kind of interesting that a group that espouses hate for another, group in the same bucket. So anyway.
Well, here's the other problem with the word Aryan, right? So in the 1850s, you've got these scholars, Western European scholars, who discover that the rest of the world actually had writing before they arrived to bring civilization to them. And so they begin translating this. And it was the Rig Veda that was translated in the 1850s. And you have it mistranslated, right? Like there was some definite failures of understanding. And you have this French writer, Arthur de Gourbineau, Gobineau, excuse me, whose ideology is based on, who adopts it based on this mistranslation as a racial category. And his ideology was based on the idea of blonde Northern European Aryans had migrated across the world to found all major civilizations before being diluted through racial mixing with local populations, which is bullshit. I don't know how to tell you this, honey, but that's incorrect, right? Like, let's start with the fact that let's just leave it at it's incredibly wrong, right? Like,
so wrong. That's not how it worked.
Using both archaeological, genetic, and linguistic studies, so I guess not both, using archaeological, genetic, and linguistic studies, this is a demonstrably incorrect fact. So let's start there, right? The whole use of this term by this subgroup of humans is wrong. Like,
it starts in a basis of wrong, and it continues in a basis of wrong, and it is wrong.
Right. So there's our first term that we've defined. The next one that I want to talk about is heathenry, and heathenry is a little bit more complex. I mean, yeah, no, let's just go more complex, right? So sometimes you'll also see heathenism, contemporary Germanic paganism, or Germanic neo-paganism. It's a modern pagan religion, typically identified as what's called a new religious movement. It's developed in Europe in the early 20th century, round about the same time that you start to see the development of neo-paganism and Wicca and all this kind of stuff. Its practitioners modeled it on the pre-Christian religions adhered to by Germanic peoples in the late Iron Age and early Middle Ages, and argue that it's an attempt to reconstruct these past belief systems. To various extents, it uses followers, to various extent, followers use archaeological, historical, and folkloric evidence as a basis, though how this material is approached definitely varies widely. So what I want to talk about is this is a really broad term, right? Like, this is an incredibly broad spectrum of ideas, and we're going to talk about different groups within those ideas. So one of the books that I read for this week is called Gods of the Blood, and it talks about the intersection of race and religion among white supremacists. And so it's not just talking about heathenism or heathenry, but that's definitely one of the major topics covered in this book. And so the author, this was a good quote that I found. The author says, here, 3 distinct positions in the Asatru triangle can be identified. You have an anti-racist position that welcomes anyone with any genuinely interested person, irrespective of race or ethnicity, to practice the religion. So that's one side of the triangle, right? The next side of the triangle is sort of the polar opposite, right? It's the racist position that defines Asatru or Odinism as an expression of the Aryan race soul and sees it as an exclusively Aryan path. So we're running directly into the problem of the definition of Aryan there, but sure, cool, right? And then you have the third end of the triangle, which is trying to sort of move past these two and says the ethnic position that not always successfully tries to move beyond the issue of race by claiming that Asatru is linked with Northern European ethnicity. So these are the 3 kind of sides. And typically today, Asatru refers to the less racialized or non-race-based form of heathenry. And Odinism refers typically to the racialized or race-based form of heathenry that does tend to focus more on the warrior culture aspect of Norse mythology. But what I want to make abundantly clear is that is not a hard and fast line, right? This is not like when you talk to somebody who's Catholic and they are definitely Catholic, they are definitely not Protestant, right? Like you don't typically cross those streams. There are exceptions to that rule where you've got Anglicans who are high church Anglicans who do not like the fact that
you're just muddying the waters here.
Right. Like this falls apart really quickly once you start talking about some specific exceptions. But generally, these two, like, there's nobody saying you can't call yourself Asatru. It's the community policing itself. Yeah. And what we're going to talk about quite a bit later, I think, is some of the early organizations that really do fall under the more racialized or definitely race-based ideologies. They start out calling themselves Asatru. So it's very difficult to just use a broad brush to say all Asatru are anti-racist or do not hold racist beliefs. All Odinists are racist, though typically if they're self-identifying as an Odinist, that's not a great sign. Like,
right, it's probably a good indication, but not all not all Odinists, right?
Right.
It's hashtag not all Odinists. But
you're definitely not starting from a great place there, right?
Yeah.
And then we have a third term, Wotanism. Wotanism can be used interchangeably with Odinism, though it typically is used by individuals seeking to highlight a more pan-Germanic aspect. Here, Wotan is understood as the pre-Norse sort of Germanic version of Odin, right? Or you'll see Wodinism for folks who are in England and want to have an English version of this. It's also used, Wotanism is also used by this guy we're going to talk about later, Guido List, who used it to refer to part of his Ariosophic religion. So we're going to talk about what Ariosophy is and how
good old Guido.
weird it is. But yeah, his name was Guido List, and he calls himself Guido von List because we'll talk about why. But he's just fucking
He's a piece
Guido.
of work. That's what he is. He's a piece of work.
So anyway, those are my definitions. Ula, take it away.
All right. Yeah. So let's talk about white nationalism. Oh, I hate even just saying this.
Really quickly. The reason that I wanted to include these definitions. So if you watch John Oliver, who I had to put his name in my notes because I kept calling him Jamie Oliver, and that is a different person. Mm-hmm. So if you watch Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, he recently did a segment on a guy named Tucker Carlson. If you want to talk about human trash, Tucker Carlson he's not a great human being, right? But one of his complaints that he makes repeatedly on his show is that whenever people want to talk about, or whenever people are talking about issues around white supremacy and white nationalism, they never define those terms. What do those terms mean? How can we say somebody is a white nationalist if we don't understand what it means? So these definitions are there specifically for Tucker Carlson, in case he later discovers our show and is like, well, they never completely.
I love it.
So this is for you, jackass.
Tucker, this is for you. Yeah. So there is a difference between white nationalism and white supremacy. So white nationalism is it's a type of nationalism it's a pan-nationalism that espouses a belief that white people are a race to themselves and seeks to develop and maintain that white racial and national identity. A lot of the proponents identify with and are attached to the concept of a white nation, a white ethno-state. But white supremacy, that's the belief that white people are superior, generally genetically superior to other races, and thus should dominate them. Yeah. The belief, and that just maintains and defends white power and white privilege. It has its roots in the now very discredited doctrine of scientific racism, which was the key to colonization and colonialism and the justification for everything that white people did to every other race. Okay, so there are white nationalists and there are white supremacists. Not all white nationalists think that the whites, they're really tied together.
The Venn diagram of these two groups, it may not be a perfect circle, but it's
pretty damn close.
Strongly circle-like.
But there are some outliers.
There's like four of them, right?
Right, yeah.
Right. But anyway, so these two ideas are deeply ingrained in this whole discussion. So it becomes very difficult. You can't really talk about how Norse history, early English history, German history. You can't talk about how that has affected the modern world without talking about all of this stuff, because it's just it's very uncomfortably and very unpleasantly intertwined. And unfortunately, you cannot separate the two, right?
You can't. It's like a bowl of spaghetti. You just can't, it's all so tangled up together. So we're going to talk a bit about the history of all of this and where did all of this come from. I have some thoughts, and there are some people that I would like to take out back and shoot. Luckily, they're really all dead now. But what came first, the romanticized nationalism or white supremacy? Which
I don't know. I mean, it's a chicken and an egg question,
it is.
Right?
It really is.
The people who, there was a book that I was hoping to get my hands on, which has probably just been delivered with my luck. I just got a buzz notification saying something was delivered. Called The Victorians and the Vikings, and it is focused entirely on the development of sort of the Viking mythos and the Viking aesthetic during the Victorian period and how they got super obsessed with it, and how that impacted British colonialism.
The Victorians just had too much damn time on their hands, is what it is, because they dug themselves into so many things.
Yeah, I don't, whatever, guys. Like,
Victorian aristocrats had way too much time on their hands and money, and
right.
that's how we got to where we are today.
Right. So the kind of the earliest stuff that I found discussing all of this was the 17th century, and you will note in this episode we are going to kind of spin off. We tried to stay really laser focused on like basically Vikings, the intersection between Vikings and white supremacy, but it becomes incredibly difficult to have that very narrowly focused conversation without explaining a bunch of other stuff. Right. So this will likely spill into another episode in the future when we have more time to do more research, because there's a 900-page book on my table that is waiting to be read, all about how all of this interplays with American politics in the last 50 years, right? Like, so there's a lot out there. We just didn't have the time to get through it. But the earliest examples that I could find are 17th century. So during the 17th century, you've got Danes and Swedes competed for the collection and publication of Icelandic manuscripts. So you'll note, by the way, that the Icelandic people are not competing for this. They're being left out. They're currently, I think at this point, they're part of Denmark. So Icelandic manuscripts, Norse sagas, and the two Eddas. In Sweden, the Icelandic manuscripts became part of an origin myth that were seen as the proof of the greatness and heroism of the ancient Geats, right? So now we've got Beowulf mixed up in all this. And it had been passed down through the generations to the current population. This pride culminated in the publication of Olaus Rudbeck's treatise, Altland eller Mannheim, in which he claimed Sweden was identical to Atlantis. So we did this in here early, right? But this is 17th century. This is 1600s, probably late 1600s. So 1679 was roughly when Altland was published. But we're starting early, right? Yeah. So this is not as far removed from the Viking Age as we are today, obviously. But right. It's still 600-ish years later. Yeah. But they're basically sort of reading this, and they're mixing it up. You've got the rise of the Enlightenment. You've got all this sort of rationalization, the early scientific movements, and so they're mixing this all into this milieu, right? Like, so this is percolating. And then you have antiquarianism. Antiquarianism arrives in the 18th century with a bang. They start chopping, like in America, what they were doing was they were moving around, like Thomas Jefferson, if I remember right, was a big into this project, where you would basically just like, you'd see a mound, like the mound builders of Cahokia type mound, right? And they just cut right through it to see what was inside. And there's a lot to be said about how Americans in the 18th and early 19th century sort of rewrote Native history and destroyed indigenous artifacts and indigenous sites in a search for sort of white ancestry. And there's this whole weird myth about, I think, Saint Brennan. Anyway, some Welsh guy in a boat, and then all of a sudden there's blonde-haired, gray-eyed Welsh babies running around the Americas, which briefly I've been to Wales, and there were very few blonde, gray-eyed people, so I'm not sure where that was going. Maybe they all went with St. Brennan.
They're all here now, right?
Anyway, so antiquarianism, the English got really into Vikings in the 18th century and wrote some truly terrible poetry, which I will now read a chunk to you. This is
so amazing.
So bad. This was written by a guy named Thomas Warton. It's part of his runic odes, and it was published in 1748. Yes, 'tis decreed my sword no more shall smoke and blush with hostile gore. To my father's feasts I go, where the luscious wines forever flow, from which the hollow skulls we drain of kings in furious combat slain. So this is some bad poetry. But what you can see here is the building of this sort of idea of the Vikings, right? Like drinking out of hollowed skulls, and it's all wine and violence. And I'm sure if you got later into the poem, there's probably some like blonde-haired naked ladies. It's this, you start to see this development in the 18th century of this hypermasculinity. Rusty says we're frozen.
Am I
Are
frozen?
we frozen?
I don't know.
I don't know either.
I'm gonna go look. Let's see.
I don't know. Are we frozen? Now it says
No?
we're all the way back at the
Rusty,
beginning.
it's just you.
Okay. And my phone says we're at minute 3.2. I'm sorry, Rusty. So anyway, so you start to see this development of this hypermasculine ideal of what a Viking is. And kind of contemporaneous with this, and like a little bit later, but kind of contemporaneous, you also start to see the rise of what's called muscular Christianity. So in both cases, it's not so much about just Viking stuff, but like the whole idea of society, like masculinity becomes this very like, you have to be hyper masculinized, right? And this is also when you start to see the rise of amateur sports and unfortunately the rise of the Olympics and all this kind of stuff as we develop this idea that good men have to be manly
men,
right? Like it's this whole shift in the idea of what a man is, and tied up in that is this rise of sort of this hypermasculine Viking ideal. So that's what we're starting to see here. This poem predates a lot of that. So 1748 predates a lot of it, but this is part of that whole conversation that's rolling forward.
Right.
So just think back to those terrible poems you wrote and know that your poems were probably better than Thomas Warden's. So that's 1748. We move forward, 1840s. You start to see this idea in England and the United States of the free white nation that has to be Anglo-Saxon in character. And this is what the book Vikings and the Victorians really kind of gets into. So unfortunately, I don't have as much information because the book is probably sitting in my mailbox right now. But one of the big things that starts to happen here is you have the explanation of achievements of a particular group of people based on the power of their blood. So our ancestors were great, therefore we have inherited that greatness and we carry it forth, right?
Well, and and I can see how you can tie that back to, if you look at the sagas are, I come from a descendant of great peoples. Like they're just carrying on this kind of mythos that is, but they just warped it in such a way that it's
right.
It's recognizable, but it's not the same thing anymore.
Right. So what you don't typically see in the sagas is I deserve. I mean, I guess you do, right?
You do.
But this is one of those things that I do want to hit on really quickly. Is as much as I enjoy the study of early medieval Scandinavia, Iron Age Scandinavia, early medieval England, I wouldn't actually want to live there, right? Like they aren't great people.
Right.
As a modern human,
right.
There are definitely problematic things with their society.
Yes.
I've seen a meme running around that's like the Vikings were gender fluid and they all this kind of stuff. And that's a really broad oversimplification of a very complex topic,
exactly.
Right? We've talked about gender in Viking Age Scandinavia, and it is a very complex, very broad subject that can't really be summed up easily in that meme. And actually, Greta, so do I have the power to do this? Greta mentioned, I almost mentioned the meme. Greta, your post about this earlier is what made me think about it. So great minds. So this is right. Like this is not meant to be the Vikings are great. Like they're cool. They built really cool ships. They wrote some really cool poetry.
Right.
But also I don't want to live there. Right.
Yeah,
like
agreed.
As a woman, not my society. Yep. Moving on.
Yep.
So anyway, so they had this whole thing about our ancestors were great. They descended down to us with their greatness, the power of our blood. So then we move in. So we're going to kind of shift. We've talked a little bit about Scandinavia. We've talked a little bit about England. Now let's shift into one of the major problems of this whole conversation, and that's Germany. And I love Germany. I truly do. Like I have spent quite a bit of time in Germany. The food is good. The people are generally really outstanding, and the trains run on time, and there's a lot to be said for that. But
there's also
trauma, right? So German Romanticism, this is a movement that kicks off in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and then kind of bleeds into what's called the Völkisch movement. So the German Romanticism is this romanticization, involves this romanticization of the German past. So romantic here, this is capital R romantic, this isn't hearts and flowers, this is like, literally in this case, Strom and Drang, and this is, we're feeling all the feelings and we're expressing them and we're getting into it, right? Like this is not the rigid, like we're casting off this early Protestant, like, dress in black, no dancing, no feelings. Bach, love Bach, but very rigid music. Mozart, love Mozart, very rigid music. We're getting into Beethoven and we're feeling our things, right? Mm-hmm. So you also, with all of that, you started to see this romanticization of the German past, and especially the Holy Roman Empire and early Holy Roman kings, right? Like here they're seen as these great warrior kings conquering. You've got Otto the Great, Charlemagne gets quite a lot of love. Or Carolus Magnus, to give his Latin name, or Karl the Grosse in Germany. And they're, at this point, they're also like, frankly, the Holy Roman Empire hasn't been gone that long at this juncture, but they're now trying to seek this unified German state. They're looking back at, we were once this big unified state and a power in the world, an absolute power in the world. We want to get back to that. We want to unify ourselves. We want to unify ourselves in terms of a culture. We want to unify our language. You start to see, this is the period in history in general where you start to see the end of regional languages in Europe. Like there still are regional languages, but this is when you're starting to see Napoleon and Napoleon's complete quashing of the Languedocs, and he's like, everybody shall speak Languedoc, and and you're starting to see kind of the same thing going on in Germany. They're like, we've got to be one people, which is, let's go back to stupid shit, right? This is deeply stupid, right? Like if you look at German history at basically any point, even under the Holy Roman Empire, the country that today we think of as Germany was never like the people in Bavaria and the people in North Rhine-Westphalia.
There's no connection.
The clothing is different. The language is
the foods are different. The environment is like, it's different. You can't.
Right. It's not. There's never a point where it's like one unified expression, right? But this is kind of what the Romantics are seeking. They want this one unified voice that they can then return to the power that they once held. So it's fucking dumb. We have, in order to encourage this, they start elevating these sort of Germanic heroes, like Siegfried and personal favorite, Hermann the German, who can actually refer to two different people. There's a guy, Hermannus Alamanus or something, who's a translator in the 13th century, who his name literally translates to Hermann the German. But Hermann the German typically refers to Arminius, and there is built during this period, there's this monument to Arminius, who was a Germanic tribal chieftain, fought the Romans. I think he's the one in Teutoburg Forest. That's a little bit of a question mark there. But you start to see this, like, the end. Ludwig II. So, have you heard of Neuschwanstein Castle, right?
Yeah.
Neuschwanstein Castle, beautiful fairy tale castle, not medieval in the least, is built by this guy, Ludwig II, King of Bavaria, who was maybe not technically like mentally ill, but was fucking bug nuts. So it's important. Like, I am not trying to.
Are we talking Winchester Mystery House kind of crazy?
Yeah. Except for, she probably did have a genuine mental illness. Ludwig, it's kind of like there's a question, right? Generally, you don't want to try and interpret a dead historical figure,
right?
Like and diagnose them with mental illness.
It's
right. And this is not me denigrating people with mental illness.
Right.
He was fucking bug nuts, right? He had this whole. So he becomes king, right? Let's have a brief moment about monarchy and why that's bad. But he becomes king, and then just sort of is very rapidly not interested in politics. What he wants is to live the life of a fairy tale king. So he starts this castle building campaign, among which the star of this collection is Neuschwanstein Castle. And it is full of Wagnerian references. And one of the things he ends up building is what's called Walhalla, the Walhalla or Valhalla Memorial. And what he wants to do, he's a big fan of this, like, Germanic romantic movement, right? So what he wants to do is elevate the great heroes of Germanic mythology and Germanic history and his family into this like he wants like you see in ancient Greece, right? Like he idolizes this architecture and everything from ancient Greece. He wants to rebuild that in Germany and raise up their history on par with sort of the great heroes of the ancient past. So he builds something that looks just like the Parthenon in Athens, and then populates it with little statues and plaques dedicated to various Germanic figures and members of his family. Very important, including his father. So he builds this, and he is a major supporter of Wagner, who's another like major character in this whole Germanic. That's what we're gonna call this.
I like Germanic. I really like Germanic. That's good.
So he's a major figure in this whole Germanic movement, and just he was feeling all his feelings. He borrowed a lot from Norse mythology.
Yeah.
You know, go see the Ring Cycle sometime, right? It's the saga of the Volsungs.
Yep.
All this kind of stuff just like plopped into classically large-breasted women with the cones and the
wings and the braids and the Wagner. Gotta love some Wagner.
But he's also like, whether there's a lot of debate about the racism or anti-Semitism of Wagner, right? Because he is an incredibly popular. He's not musician. That's the wrong composer, right? And his music is of cultural value, yes. But he also was probably not a real great guy,
right?
And this is not. I don't want to have a conversation about like death of the author and all that kind of stuff, but because that's an incredibly long conversation. We've already been going for 40 minutes, right? And we are guys. We're on page 2 of our notes, so.
We'll try to get this going. Honest, but this is
but he is like, so Parsifal is a great example, right? And this is another quote from Gods of the Blood. The quest for the Holy Grail in Parsifal symbolized the folkish longing for Aryan Christ, a mystery cult centered on the redeeming force of pure German blood. So he is, if not, no, let's just like, the guy's probably a white supremacist. Like, let's just go there, right? That doesn't mean I don't really love Ride of the Valkyrie, right? Like it's 80 degrees out, you put the windows down, you listen to it, you have a great time, right? Like, yep. But you also have to be absolutely capable of acknowledging that this is music written by a shitty human being.
Yep. Yeah.
So I like,
you have to be able to equalize,
right? And
the art from the person.
You're not forgiving this person. You're not saying, well, their art is so good that we should forget that. And I think there are very important conversations to be had around some of his music, especially pieces like Parsifal, and how they treat, like how that music treats people who aren't like him.
Yes.
But like, it's an incredibly, there's no good answer here, right? Like, this is just, this is something you just constantly have to think about and constantly have to be having that conversation with yourself. And just like, this is the difficult history. This is the reality of the subject.
Yeah.
And moving on. So anyway, speaking of moving on, Ula, why don't you talk about it? So I mentioned the folkish movement. Why don't you get into that?
All right. So the folkish movement. So the folk movement, the people's movement. So it's the successor to the German Romanticism, or what did you say? Germanicism? Germanicism. It's the success. It follows after the Germanic Romanticism and sets up the foundation for what becomes the Nazi Party and the Nazi period. So I love that the note here is just lots of blood and soil talk, but that's exactly what it is. It is lots of we the peoples, and it's this is our land. We've toiled it with our blood. Let's, and our blood is the strong blood. It's very much in that.
So one thing I want to comment on really quickly is as much as this sounds like it would be a very populist movement, especially with a name like folkist, it is a movement largely promulgated and sort of perpetuated by the elite class of German society,
yes.
Right? So as much as they're talking about like our blood is in the soil and we worked,
they never toiled the soil.
They didn't, right? Like this is the Ralph Lauren Cowboys, right? Like this is
a great description of it,
right? Like
Yeah.
That's a motif that has pissed me off for a very long time. Ralph Lauren in his cowboy gear. Like, I'm sorry, you want me to buy $500 jeans so that I can
right.
what?
Yeah, you're right. This is exactly what it is. It's the elite and upper classes using this as a way to promote themselves and control the populace. Is really what part of it is. So yeah, and they idealize the myth of an original nation that and you could still find this at times in the rural regions of Germany. A primitive democracy. Oh, this is a great quote. Where did you get this quote?
This is all blood and smell.
Form of primitive democracy freely subjected to the natural elites. So it's the folk turned into this idea of a racial essence that the folk thinkers are folkish, the folk kind, refer to the term as the birth giving, the quasi entity, a quasi eternal entity, the same way that they would write the nature rather than a sociological category. Yeah, it's all tied to German folklore, local histories, the back to the land anti-urbanism movement that was happening at the same time.
It gets so they start pulling from if folks like the arts and crafts movement, you'll have heard of William Morris.
William Morris, yep.
Right. So William Morris was a lot of that, like back to the land anti-urbanism and like looking back to history. So these guys, the folkish writers, start pulling from William Morris's writings, right? Like, and you start to see this exchange. And it's, again, I love William Morris's art.
Absolutely. But yeah, it's right. And it's that the ideology was a revolt against modernity. Yes, I can't talk. I can't talk. You're the linguist here. And it's this back to and it's still I can't even wrap my brain around how these elite classes were doing this back to the land thing, because it's not how any of this works. But
so I think really kind of the key quote in this whole chunk and what really kind of helps understand it is you have a primitive democracy freely subjected to their natural elites. So this is the elite going to trying to sell this idea to the people that they should live in harmony with the land and freely subject themselves.
Right, to the elites. We're going where they really, they wanted a more feudal society. They wanted they didn't want the land workers to be slavish, but it was all for the betterment of the elite.
Right. So I think a big part of what's happening here, right, you have the rise of industrialism. And the rise of industrialism, with the rise of industrialism, you start to see the disintegration of the aristocratic elite. So I think at this point, my German history is a little fuzzy in the 19th century, but I think at this point it's still it must be, because the World War I is a Kaiser. So at this point it's still a monarchy, but they're really starting to, like, the power of the monarchies in Europe is really starting to crumble,
diminish. Right, they're diminishing, and the power is going more regional to regional houses again.
Well, but not even
the industrial power leaders, the business.
You start to see business leaders become more powerful, and frankly, people like unions, the beginning of the union movement, the power of workers to come together and say, we're not going to work your machines, you do it, boo. Right? Like you start to see this investment of power. I don't want to say like more it is democratization, right? Like
it is.
But it's the power is seeping out of the elite. So now the elite are trying to create a myth and
grab that power back.
It says, weren't things better when we were all in charge? Weren't things better in the ancient past, in this sort of glorious Germanic past, which, depending, I don't know what life was like in the 19th and 20th, early 20th century for a German peasant or a German city worker. I'm imagining it wasn't great, right? Like,
yeah.
And so Bradley, we had a comment just come in. Bradley, tiny home movement. We're not going to talk about tiny homes, but we will talk briefly, if we have time, about cottagecore and kind of where that problem lies. But anyway, so you start to see this breakup, and so the elite are like, shit, right? Like
Right.
we don't want to lose our
We don't
power.
want to lose our power. What can we do to keep control of our power, our wealth, our people? Yeah.
Right. So they started to call back to this heroic past, which in Germany, England, and Scandinavia means that they're calling back to Vikings, Saxons, Angles, less the Utes. Surprisingly, the Utes, again, left out of it, right? And then the tribes of Germany and the Holy Roman Empire, and they're saying things were great. We were powerful back then. Let's get back to it. So time of stress,
right,
populism.
Right. And this is a great quote from the Gods of the Blood, and I'm going to have to get that book. I don't want to, but I think I need to get it. American heathens tend to find important predecessors in the pan-Germanic Volkish movement. Asatru magazines and websites frequently carry articles about Volkish philosophy, secret societies, and pagan revivalism. Asatru veteran and rune magus Edred Thorson has popularized Volkish thought by translating Ariosophic, there we go, it took me a second, Ariosophic classics, and by publishing the studies of Germanic magic and rune lore. And that we're actually going to touch on at the end, later, some of the runic stealings. Like they really love to pick apart and cherry pick from the sagas and the runes and kind of warp them into what works best to promote their media machine, is what it all boils down to.
So what I wanted to highlight with that quote is that okay. So the reason I like runes, right? As a orthographic system, I find them very interesting. Also, calligraphy, primo, right? Like if you have to do, if in the SCA you're doing a scroll and somebody's like, I want runes, you're like, hot diggity, because those are a lot easier to write than like Batard or one of the more complex scripts, or the Gothic book scripts, right? Like, give me runes any day, straight lines and angles, check. But I get really uncomfortable once we start to get into this like runic magic concept, because it becomes very, very difficult to separate out what was historically runic magic, which, you know,
and what's been ascribed to it.
Right. And there is historical evidence for it, right? The Havamal talks all about the runes that Odin receives at the tree, right? Like, so there is a historical element, but then we're going to talk about the Ariosophic movement and the movements that are going on during the Folkish and Germanic periods. It's Germanic from here on forward, guys.
Germanic, I love Germanic.
Right. So that kind of invent a lot of missing bits.
Yes.
And so as you look at books today that are published recently, a lot of them are borrowing not solely from this historical the material that is of the period, like the Havamal, right? They're borrowing not just from that,
but of the inserts that have been stuck in
all this other stuff. And it becomes incredibly difficult to separate out the white supremacist and racist bits of that. You'll read modern authors trying to carve their way around it, but it is not a carvable subject. Like, this is an incredibly complex and interwoven thing. And so that was, I guess this is as good a time as any to briefly talk about my personal history, right? So I went to the University of Iowa. When I went to the University of Iowa, I knew nobody down there. Okay, that's not true. I knew there was one other girl from my high school who was going. We didn't get along, so we didn't hang out. But I got down there. I had no friends. I had no family. I was an introvert, alone in a new land. And I went down there. I got into Viking Age history in like 5th grade, right? Like that, and I was sold.
Right.
I had learned about the Battle of Hastings in 6th grade. It was called
studies,
the smart kids went off site and they
did tag program or whatever.
Right. So I got sent off to that, and we did a whole unit on the Battle of Hastings, and I was like, sign me up. This is the coolest stuff. And so I've been excited about it since a young age. And by the time I went to college, like, I was raised Christian, but I was now I'm like feeling it out. Like, what do I really believe? So I'd kind of started looking at paganism. Maybe this is where I'm going to find my place. And so I met some folks down there who were Asatru. And they were like, yeah, we're doing this pagan thing. It's a lot of like Viking stuff. And I was like, I like Vikings. paganism sounds interesting. I'll check it out, right? So I went and I started joining that group. I started going to their meetings and meeting people. And I am very grateful that the next group that I found was the SCA, because the SCA ended up pulling my attention away. And as I was disengaging from this Acid True group, you started to hear terms that, in retrospect, were really kind of red flags. So initially, the folks that I met were generally pretty chill, right? Like, totally reasonable sounding people. Nobody was talking about race. Nobody's like there's no anti-Semitism being batted about. But it started, like, people start talking about, like, our heritage, our, like, this is our people.
Our people, our rights, our...
You're being eased into it, but it didn't sound wrong.
It doesn't start out sounding bad. It's, right. But, you drink the Kool-Aid a little bit at a time.
I would like to think that I'm a smart person. I am, empathetic. I care about the world around me, and I would never have gone down that path.
Right.
But I really am incredibly grateful for the SCA, because the SCA pulled me out and said, "You're excited about history? Here's a
different outlet. Here's a better outlet."
Yes. Right. Yeah. Let's get into it. And I ended up getting excited about that and going down that path. And I never had to find out if my opinion of myself was as good as I think it is, if I would live up to my own opinion of myself or my own hope for myself. Right. So, and one of the papers that I read for this week was a master's thesis from a gentleman at the University of Iowa, published not long after I graduated. He was getting his master's in religion, and he interviewed Odinists in Iowa City. And reading it and reading how some of it's written, I really do wonder very strongly if some of those people were in the group I was in. Right. So, I almost went down that path. And so I really wonder, like, what would I have been introduced to? What are ideas that would have come up in this sort of milieu as they're pulling from historical and definitely very racist ideas and like sort of rehashing it and trying. Some of the authors are doing, a goodwill effort, right? Like good faith. That's what I'm hearing. Good faith effort to excise the racism, excise the supremacy and the nationalism. But it is really impossible to do. You have to be, if this is a path that you follow, this is not me condemning you outright. This is me saying you need to be
careful
every moment of every day that, some of the people who influenced the development of these religions were not good people. Yeah. Some of the people who influenced the development of Christianity were not good people. Like this is not just a statement. This is Claire, the irreligious person, talking about religion. But let's move on, because we're now almost an hour in, and
I know, and we're not even All right, so Scandinavianism.
Right, Scandinavianism, it's an ideology. It pops up in the 19th century again. This was this idea. So initially, it starts out life as this idea that we should unify Scandinavia without Finland. So this is Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. This idea was...
So we'd already unified once in 13...
Yeah, the Kalmar Union. So you have the Kalmar Union, right? And sort of at various points... 1840s is when this whole thing starts, right? So various points, you have Denmark and Norway are a personal union from 1537 to 1814. Sweden and Norway was a personal union from 1814 to 1905. And then Finland and Sweden, that's a hot mess, right? So, but they largely leave Finland out of this discussion. And interestingly, so Iceland is part of Denmark. In that, like, Iceland is a colony of Denmark for all of this, and the Faroes, we're not even going to get into the Faroes. They're off doing the Faroe Islands.
Not the Egyptian pharaohs, but the Faroe Islands.
Right.
Yes.
So there's this brief idea. Look, guys, we are all largely mutually comprehensible. Nobody can understand the Danes, but that's their fault.
That's the Danes, fault. Though. What are you going to do?
They use the soft D. It confuses all of us. What is bull? We don't understand bull. Like, fucking, that word makes me so mad, guys. Scandinavian, but it's so we've got this shared linguistic and cultural heritage. Why don't we just be one country? This was never going to happen. It will never happen. Sorry, guys. Eventually, though, you have the breakup of these personal unions. So Norway splits, like I said, from Denmark in 1814, and then it's with Sweden from 1814 to 1905. And kind of in the period where these these changes are happening, right? Like 17 something to the 1800s, 1905, you start to see this rising nationalism in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway.
Yeah.
Largely Norway, right? Like Norway is really where they're feeling their feelings. At this time, so 19th century, you're also late 19th, early 20th century. What you're also seeing is the first major Viking Age finds.
Right.
So the Oseberg ship was excavated in 1904.
And that just added fuel to the fire, because there's all these amazing things being found, right, which just adds to our people were better way back when. Like our ancestors were better than your ancestors because, yeah.
Right. So Norway's feeling its feelings. Iceland at this point is just trying to survive, which is basically what they'll do right up until World War II.
That's all Iceland has ever done is tried to survive. Let's be real.
Out there, they are just trying to live their life, and they've banned alcohol. So, and then Sweden starts to get really into the Goths. This is Gothicism. They're calling back to the ancient Goths, and they're saying Sweden was the land of the ancient Goths. The Goths took down the Roman Empire. How great are we? So they start calling back to the Goths. The king of Sweden may have been previously, but I know at some point he starts calling himself the king of the Goths.
I didn't know that.
As a part of his title. Right. But I don't remember when that happens. That may be during this period. That may be before. So anyway, so Scandinavia, they're really building up this nationalism. They're getting really excited about the Vikings. They're starting to sort of publish information. It's becoming available to the broader world. And so this you now have this sort of flowering going on, right? Like all these things are kind of happening all at once in different parts of the world. So out of this whole Germanticism, like Scandinavianism, whatever the fuck was going on in England with their antiquarians and their bad poetry, and frankly, their dreams of empire and then actual empire.
Empire. I mean, they did a pretty good job of that for quite a while.
There was an empire there for a bit. Which, sorry, sidetrack. Okay, Nigel Farage. Let me briefly have a moment about Nigel fucking Farage. So if you're unaware of who he is a bad man, capital B, capital M. Mm-hmm. Very unpleasant human being. He was on, so there was the Meghan Markle, Harry...
Oh yeah,
name Harry Wales. I don't know what he's using. Right. So they were on TV. They were interviewed by Oprah, and this sort of kicked off a little bit of a storm about, is the royal family racist? Which I don't understand why there's a question there, but sure, okay. Anyway, so Nigel Farage comes on TV and says in his very RP is received pronunciation. It's sort of Queen's English. Yeah. It's the pronunciation that was used by BBC presenters for a long time. You had to have an RP accent in order to present on the BBC. Anyway, he comes on with his very RP accent and says, nobody in history has done more for people of color than the British monarchy. And you're like,
excuse me. I'm sorry, what?
And then
I just gotta say, I mean, his name's Nigel. Is there anybody named Nigel that's not a dillweed? Oh.
But it's just like, Nigel, you're wrong.
Yeah.
Buddy. Right. About so many things. Anyway, so that's Claire's shouting about Nigel Farage. Guido von List. Okay.
Guido.
So out of this whole like nationalism, we're getting excited. We're starting to learn things about the past, but because it's the 19th century and the early 20th century, we're not actually great at research. So we're just going to make shit up. And
we don't have the internet yet. Give us a break.
Right. Yeah. Or something. So here comes Guido. And Guido was born in 1848. He dies in 1919. So he lives to see World War I, misses World War II. He comes to all this kind of stuff, and he says, so there's this movement going on, Theosophy, which I don't want to really get into too much, but it's basically like a mysticism. You're mixing Eastern and Western mysticism, and we're feeling our feels. And there's another woman that I don't have any notes on, but is completely worth looking up. So he mixes this Theosophy, and then we have what's called Gnostic racism, which is just like, other shit, and then adds Norse paganism to this mix and creates something that he calls Ariosophy. Ariosophy is knowledge from the Aryans, is what that word means. So here's this is if you're interested in this kind of if you're interested in this history, the book you want is Gods of the Blood. Obviously, that book has provided a lot of quotes for this episode, and it's provided a lot of the research for this episode. I completely recommend people reading it. So von Lisk claimed that the Edda confirmed theosophical historiography. The different realms of Muspelheim, Asgard, Vanaheim, and Midgard found in Norse mythology corresponded to the theosophic cosmogony, with its subsequence of manifest elements, fire, air, water, and earth. The three subsequent logi, this word coming from the Greek logos, of the theosophical speculation were identified as the Allfather Wotan, or Odin, his two sons, Vila and Ve. So he's basically taking this sort of mashup mysticism and just like overlaying it with and saying, oh, look, no, this explains Norse mythology. Suddenly this all makes sense. So he adds like Norse sauce to this underlying already weird, racist nonsense, right? He goes on, he says, clearly, based on all this, Aryan man was a reflection of the ancient Norse gods and goddesses and a glimpse of future glory when man's innate divinity would be fully manifest. So this is like, this is really, so he's feeling his feelings, and he looks at the various sources that he has available to him, which one imagines were not great. And he says that he from them discerns, and discernment is, we got feelings about the word discernment, but he discerns from all of this that there were two religions practiced in ancient Germania. You had the exoteric versus the esoteric religion. The former, the exoteric religion, was a religion of nature, known as Wotanism, adapted to the needs and level of sophistication of the heathen commoner. So basically, he's like, the poor people had their religion, which was basically like worshiping the flowers and the trees and just like that stuff. And that's Wotanism. The latter, the esoteric religion, is an initiatory mystical religion. So now he's looking back to ancient Greece and ancient Greece and Rome and the mysteries, Dionysus, what's the mysteries? What's the big mystery cult that we don't know anything about, but it's like completely fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
Greta, if you're still watching, if you remember,
I know what you're talking about, but I can't.
Right. So anyway, the something mysteries, it's really going to bug me now. So he's looking back to that, and he's like, well, clearly the Germans had their own mystery cult. And he calls this Armanism, and he says, "No, it's not Mithras.
It's not Mithras. It's
the something mysteries." Well, we tried. Anyway, so he adopts that idea. He calls it Armanism. He says it is exclusive to the Armanenschaft, which is an elite class of Wotanist priest-king scientists. So that priest-king scientist thing, he's pulling from Plato. He's like, you have gold souls, the silver souls, the iron souls, and like, so these are priest-king scientists educated at occult and secular sciences at various Armanen lodges around the heathen world. So there is no evidence for any of this.
Where the hell did he get that?
So the way that he comes to all of this and his evidence for it is that he is a reincarnated Armanist priest king.
I'm going with a little milk of the poppy there. That's what I think is going on.
I don't know, but he just starts like he comes up with this whole notion of reincarnation. He tosses reincarnation into the whole pot, and this is when he goes from Guido List to Guido von List. So von, the Illusion Mysteries. I think that's right. I think that's the one I was thinking of. Elysian Mysteries, maybe. Maybe. Bradley, I think you're onto it. So he adds this von bit to his name to indicate his aristocratic origins. Whatever, dude. Anyway, so he just sort of like interprets
shit up
evidence presented to him, and he comes up with this occult key, he calls it, with which he interprets hidden meaning embedded in artifacts and lore across the German landscape. So now he's just like, he'll look at something and he's like, my secret knowledge tells me that it means this, which is just like, part of me would be like, okay, you do you, boo. But he also argues for an Aryan war of aggression
Yeah.
to exterminate the racial enemies and restore an Aryanist empire. He prophesied that an army of reincarnated Aryan soldiers slain on the battlefield would return under the leadership of the strong one from above to inaugurate a 1,000-year Reich. And here we have our first mention of a Reich that will last 1,000 years. And if you recognize that term, you know where we're going.
Yep.
So right.
Yeah. The Aryan war of aggression. Again, remember that Aryan it's not a thing. So let's just start with it's not a thing, and then you're gonna have a war of aggression on a thing that's not a thing. But we'll move on from that. So yeah, well, we're gonna try to move on from that. All right. So you guys can see where this groundwork is coming from. Then we get into Adolf Lanz, or Jorg Lanz. He's another Adolf, 1874 to 1954. He loves this Guido dude. Like, just thinks that everything that Guido's talking about is the right stuff, and this is, the best thing ever. So he signed a declaration endorsing the proposed Guido von List-Schalkenkraft. I can't even say it. The Guido von List Society was founded in 1900. Because he's like, I'm gonna make. You know what I need to do? I need to make the Ulla Brenna's daughter society. Because seriously, if I can just make a society out of the cult of me, well, it wouldn't get very far. But I
would participate in the Ulla cult.
So Guido started this society named from himself in 1908. He also founded the esoteric organization, the Order of the New Templars. So that's where we're going. Yeah, Order of the New Templars in 1907. These movements were supposed to further the racial self-confidence by doing pedigree and racial research, beauty contests, and the founding of racist future sites in underdeveloped parts of the earth.
Yeah, don't try the German bit.
I'm not even going to try the German. But holy hell, this whole furthering racial self-confidence by pedigree and racial research. You see where this is going here, right? So there really is a pretty direct line from von List to the Thule Society, which is the beginning of the German Workers' Party, and then to Hitler. So I mean, like, you can just see where this is all sliding down to.
And really quickly, so first off, Lanz, so it's Adolf Josef Lanz is his given name.
Yeah.
He goes by Jorg Lanz, and he eventually adds another aristocratic von, so he adds von Lebensfels. So Lebensfels. So he, like, this is you can see where he's drawing from List's nonsense, and he sort of builds on that. And something, though, that I do want to make pretty clear is that Hitler repeatedly says this isn't where he got his ideas. And he actually, I think, banishes Lanz or something, or Lanz goes into exile.
Yeah. Yes.
So he claims that he doesn't derive any of this stuff.
He banished him because it was a competitor.
Right, but like if you plugged this into one of those, if you plugged his ideas and these ideas into one of those things that they used to make you put your papers in for school to find
comparison tool thing, the anti-plagiarism tool.
Yeah, there we go, plagiarism. That's the word I wasn't coming up with. You would probably find a lot of like those red lines where they're like, "This is unsighted plagiarism."
Yeah.
So. Just making, I wanted, in case somebody like goes and looks this up later and is like, well, Hitler said he didn't believe in this. Like,
yeah, Hitler said he didn't, but yeah. So then we get into so we got the German Workers' Party. Okay, we're talking early unions. We're talking, all right. I mean, I could buy some of that. So Hitler joined an established German Workers' Party, the established German Workers' Party, not long after it was founded, within like a year. And because he was a charismatic dude, he took over really quickly. He renamed the organization the National Socialist German Workers' Party in just the following year. and put out a 25-part program that became the basis for this party. So some of the points of his program and what he espoused was it's the Union of Germany, equal rights for the German people. Okay, I'll buy that. Lands and territories, basically colonies, for the people because they have too many people and they need somewhere to put them.
I feel like there's a better approach to this, which might be like having a conversation with your people about,
Birth control.
There you go.
But that's a whole other thing.
But so, he's like, no, we need the realm.
But even then, the colonialism, we're talking, this is 1920-ish. The colonialism, like British colonialism, is just on the decline. It's still, there's still a lot going on out there. So the idea of finding colonies to put these excess people, I don't like it, but okay. But then we get into the only those of German blood can be citizens, and specifically calls out Jews. Like, this is where it goes off the rails.
Yeah, and something we haven't talked about is there is a strong amount of anti-Semitism
throughout all of this.
Like, that is European history, if you were unaware, is a wash.
Oh, I have a great book of Jews in the Middle Ages, and it is just amazing. I highly recommend it. It's some amazing work of some of the hoops and the bullshit, because it's the difference, and it's all based on its religious differences and Christianity versus Judaism, and there's just so much backstory there. So only those of German blood can be citizens. Specifically calls out Jews. Non-Germans are foreigners and subject to alien laws. They can't hold any level of office. They cannot have any wealth. They can't, if you're not German of German blood, and it goes as far as and says that non-citizens, Jews, are a drain on resources. Remember, this is the Great Depression. There's not a lot of resources going around. And to expel all of these non-citizens from the Great Germany so that we can be a Great Germany again. This includes specifically anybody that arrived in Germany after August 2nd, 1914. If you came in on August 1st, you are cool.
Just really briefly, guys, if you're listening and in the back of your head, you're hearing Make America Great Again.
Ding, ding, ding. Yeah. So the regular army is replaced by the folk army, aka a militia. Again, this is starting to sound a little familiar. All newspapers must be written by Germans and in German. There's no other. You cannot have a French newspaper. You cannot have,
it's fake news.
What?
Other non-German newspapers.
Non-German. All Germany, all the time. All funds and wages need to be pooled. Industries have to share profits. The government decides who receives aid, who receives education. Again, this is sounding a little familiar to me. The party quickly grew among the working class because of the socialist orientation. So we've got a depression. We have people that don't have enough funds and don't have enough resources. So this actually sounds like a good deal. Like, if we all work together, we'll all be better off. I could see where this is. Okay. World War I veteran groups started becoming the strong arm groups protecting meetings and rallies. So we didn't even touch on World War I. We're not going to get into that. But there is there were tones in World War I and in the surrender that it was because the Jews stabbed Germany in the back, and there's just a whole lot of shit about that. In 1923, Hitler and the party attempted to overthrow the Bavarian government. It's where he was living. That didn't work so well. Hitler spent about a year in jail. But when he came out in 1925 or end of 24, the party grew from 25,000 people in 1925 to 180,000 in 1929. It put in place district leaders who would run for and then contest elections in municipal, state, and federal level. Again, I believe we've had a lot of contested elections lately. Sounding familiar, right? So the Depression added a lot of traction to the party because there weren't enough resources to go around. So some little deft political maneuvering, and Hitler was named chancellor by the German Republic president, Paul von Hindenburg, in 1833. So we all know what happened after that. we don't even need to talk about the next 9 years from 33 to 45, but that is where, I mean, Hitler just took so much of this and cultivated this Norse history and we're going to talk if we ever get to it at the end about some of the symbolisms that he used. But his party took on Norse runes and this ideology that if we go back to the old ways of our people, Germanic and Norse, then we will pull ourselves out of this mud that we're in right now of the Depression and the German people being downtrodden.
So wanted to highlight really quick comment from Virginia that Germany had some pretty hefty fines and war reparations in the wake of World War I. It's absolutely correct.
Yes.
And that certainly did nothing good for their economy, right? And didn't do a whole lot in terms of positive impacts as they rolled into World War II. So Virginia, excellent highlight there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one of the things, so I will briefly talk about Nazis and Nazi mysticism here. So they generally what you will see with sort of Nazi use of history is that they sought a sort of pan-Germanic ideal. So under that umbrella came the Vikings, came the Anglo-Saxons, kind of came the Franks. Like the French are kind of a big question mark, but they figured the Dutch would be on board, right? So they were looking sort of at the Germanic linguistic group and saying, guys, we have this shared ancient past. You should all join us, right? And they sort of glorified that shared ancient past. And you saw with sort of these ideas of Nazi mysticism adopting Ariosophy. There's this woman who is, we're not going to talk about because I just don't have notes on her for today. Savati Devi, I think is her name. Savitri Devi. She's actually she was born Maximiani Julia Portas, so she's not actually an Indian woman. But her ideas strongly pulled from the Theosophy movement, sort of in that milieu with Ariosophy and all this kind of stuff, and informed a lot of sort of the Nazi elites' mystic ideas. And so Himmler was big fan of all this kind of stuff, and he had right. He's the head of the SS. He had this whole like mystical side to all of that, and there was a castle. They built the black sun rune into the floor, and like if an SS officer died, they all had these rings. The ring had to be returned to the castle for preservation, so that it was like a sign that you're not only was your devotion to the order to the SS, right, perpetual into after your death, but there was like this power that was involved in that, and this you get into this sort of like reincarnated Aryan warrior nonsense, and that all kind of folds together in this broader landscape of what's coming out of like 18th and 19th century romanticism and all that kind of stuff, and all kind of coming together, right? Yeah. So there is a lot there that we're skipping over and not getting into that will be important later. I think we mentioned already, we're probably going to fold this into a second episode at some point. We've been going for an hour and 15 minutes and we still have a lot to go, guys. So we may
actually need to like drop some of this. Maybe we do the religious part as a whole separate thing.
Well,
I don't know.
We'll see.
Let's just keep going for now.
Let's keep going. Okay. So we're not skipping World War II and all of its implications because we don't think it's important. We're skipping it because
it's a more commonly known thing.
It's a more commonly known thing. And frankly, like I didn't have time to do my reading on it. Like I had to pick and choose, right? And Ula's got her own life. She's got to make her choices too. Yeah. So we will probably revisit this in the future. And when we do, we will get into that specifically. So, and the other thing I wanted to note is that after World War I, you have a lot of veterans who get involved in Germany in this sort of post World War I, sort of the rise of the Nazi Party, and this is something that you see mirrored in America after the Vietnam War.
Yes,
and there's a very, very good book on this called "Bring the War Home." It's about the rise of the militia movement in post-war America, white supremacy and the militia movement in post-Vietnam America. we're going to talk a tiny bit about that today, but that is a book that I absolutely recommend. It is fascinating.
We see that now as well with veterans returning from the Middle East, right? There is definitely, because there's shit you see that you can't unsee, and that's
trauma, right? Trauma is a real thing, and you got to you got to deal with trauma, right? And this isn't saying, again, this is not saying all veterans come back and join.
No, not of course not. But there is a correlation, and it's understandable why that. I get the correlation, knowing a bunch of vets. Like I get it. It's
so. Let's talk about post-war.
Post-war.
So, by the way, the header of every category today has been something bullshit. Just for you in our notes.
So we have post-war bullshit. We have Nazi bullshit.
Yeah.
We have what did we have? We had Scandinavian. All kinds of bullshit.
So post-war bullshit. So you start to see this return to this idea of neo-paganism in the 60s and 70s. This corresponds with the rise of the militia movement during and after the Vietnam War. You also kind of see post like Wicca starts to get more popular. You're starting to with the hippie movement, right? People are starting to explore different ways of connecting with the divine, and one of the ways that you see people doing this is through neo-paganism and the rise of heathenism, return of heathenism. And that gets very quickly, because it has a very strong warrior ethos, gets very quickly tied up with the militia movements. So we're going to move our focus now from Europe, where we've been really kind of focused to this point, to the Americas. So right around all of this, right, people are becoming aware of Leif Erikson. Like obviously people knew about him, but the story of Leif Erikson is becoming more popular in mainstream histories. I don't actually remember when the Lanceau Meadow dig was, but yeah, you're going to Google that.
I'm going to Google that.
I want to say that it was right around in this time. So suddenly there's this big question, like, now we have evidence that the Norse came to America. How far into America did they get? We'll remember back when we talked about, in November, when we talked about the archaeology of Vikings in America, we talked a little bit about the Kensington runestone. There's no evidence that it was created, at least to the best of my knowledge, created to fold in with all of this, but it certainly was folded in with all this. It was picked up very quickly by some of these groups as proof that the Vikings got further into America. And you start to see this idea that, well,
it was 1960.
So 1960 Meadow.
Yeah,
so
and the dig happened from 1960 to 1968 was the
right. So this is all very clearly connected, like getting tied up together. So you have some people who are developing theories. Some people here, largely groups like McKellen, who we're going to talk about here in a second, McNallen, excuse me, who start to argue, well, the Norse got here a long time ago. A lot of them came, and they clearly influenced indigenous American traditions, like the sweat lodge. They connect the sweat lodge to the sauna. The sun dance becomes a Norse midsummer ceremony, and then they start to discern connections between terms like sweet medicine people, iron shirts, and whitewater spirits. This is discussed much more in detail in Blood of the Gods. And then there's Kennewick Man. So Kennewick, we're moving forward in history now. Kennewick Man is 1996. He's discovered July 28th, 1996. It's a prehistoric Paleo-American man found on the bank of the Columbia River in Kennewick, Washington. It is one of the most, if not the most complete Paleo-American skeleton found to date. Like it is an absolute trove. Yeah. And there is a legal act in the United States that says any I think it's pre-Columbian skeleton found in areas that are connected with indigenous American settlement, or if a connection can be made between the local tribe and the skeleton, it is the property of the local tribe to rebury and treat as
and to do it, to properly ceremonialize and do that.
Right. So any studies, any of that kind of stuff, the permission has to be granted by the tribe, and they can't.
So I'm actually from this area so Kennewick. The Kennewick Man was big, big topic of conversation. Huge fights over Kennewick Man.
Right.
Yeah.
So there were a number of lawsuits. A group of scholars from the Smithsonian wanted to study it. The local indigenous group, which I had the name of, and I did not write it down because I'm a freaking idiot, said, look, this law gives us the right to make a decision here, and we believe that it should be reburied. The skeleton should be reburied and treated with respect, and not studied for genetic material or anything like that. And then you have this guy, Stephen McNellan, who is the leader of a group. He founded the group, Asatru Folk Assembly, and he said that this skeleton, which James Chatters, who is the first Umatilla tribe.
Umatilla. Yes, it is the Umatilla tribe. Thank you.
So the first anthropologist to examine the skull his name was James Chatters. He said it lacked the definitive characteristics of the classic Mongoloid stock, which I realize that is an anthropological term, but boy howdy, it is.
I know. It just makes me cringe.
Right. Yes. So a classic Mongoloid stock to which the modern Native Americans belong, and added that it had many of the characteristics of the skull are definitive of modern day Caucasoid people. So that's quoting him, right? What's very important to note at this juncture is Caucasoid does not necessarily equal white person. It can, but it can also mean Ainu, like the Ainu of Japan, and another number of other groups in sort of Eastern Eurasia, right?
Yep.
Which, when you think about the location of the Bering Strait, across which presumably the Bering Land Bridge, right, like the sort of Bering Land Bridge theory, as they came across Eurasia and then down, and then you get into like, is it island hopping? Is it coastal? Like, how did this work, right? And I don't know enough about it to have an opinion there.
Yeah.
But when you think about the location of Eastern Eurasia compared to the Bering Land Sea Bering Sea,
the Bering Land Bridge,
location of
Scandinavia
or wherever, and one of those two places makes a lot more sense than the other.
Yep.
So cool, but McNallen persists. He says, Kennewick man is our ken, forged by the same powers that made us. The Asatru Folk Assembly will continue to stand by this ancient one, and will not let our heritage be hidden by those who seek to obscure it.
Fuck him and fuck everything about him.
Right. So the Smithsonian, the Umatilla, the Smithsonian, the Umatilla tribe, and kind of the Asatru Folk Assembly get into a three-way fight over who has possession of the remains.
It was so ugly.
Yeah, it was. This is recent history. This was a very ugly fight. The Umatilla tribe was permitted to perform ceremonies over the remains and I'm not entirely sure what the focus of the ceremonies was, but I'm assuming it was like a cleansing or some sort of respect for the dead kind of moment. Yeah. When the Asatru Folk Assembly heard about that, they were very offended that the Umatilla group had been permitted to perform their ceremonies, but the lawsuit hadn't been settled, so there's no proof yet that it belongs to them. So it may still. So they were then permitted to go in and perform a ceremony as well, which really pisses me off, frankly. Like, you're reaching for straws, trying to make this like weird connection and completely ignoring, like, they do not have any grounding in anthropological study, anything like that. They're just like, they're cherry picking this report. They're saying, well, obviously we're related.
Yeah.
Fuck you, my guy. Which, so sorry, again, sidetrack. Then we're going to talk briefly about the Northwest Imperative and some other stuff. We're getting into really modern stuff. This is going to have to be a separate episode because my notes are literally Northwest Imperative, the goddamn motherfucking Order of the Trapezoid, and ecofascism. And that is the sum total of my notes. So what I have a problem with is genetic tests to tell you your ancestry.
Yeah.
I've had one done. I was a little leery of it, but my mom, my dad, my sister had all had one done. And so at that point it was like, okay.
Yeah, genetic material is already in the data bank. You might as well do it.
Like, so now I'm curious. I want everybody to keep in mind that those tests are like 50% science, 50% bullshit. Mm-hmm. They are very much something that they are trying to sell you, right? Like, it will not tell you, I am not actually 7% Welsh, right? Like,
there's some genetic markers that have some similarity. Like, it's
modern Welsh populations
right
in their database, right? Like,
yes.
so one of the problems, of course, is that their databases are very heavily skewed white.
European. Very European.
Very heavily skewed. So, like, if you're African American or you have some African descent, you are not going to. Your
hits are gonna be with the Africans, European Africans over African Africans, like because that's where their database is skewed, because they're only comparing against their own data.
Right. So
it's a closed circuit there.
The other thing that it won't tell you is, like, the ancient past. Human migration.
It's a thing
been occurring since we left Olduvai Gorge, right? Like since Lucy took her steps out and said, "Look, there's an open space.
Let's go check that out."
Right? I guess she didn't actually leave Olduvai Gorge, but it doesn't matter. Right? Like, there is human migration is absolutely a thing that happens. People are constantly moving. Just because your genetic data says that you are, in my case, 7% Welsh, that does not mean that I have had any family members who lived in Wales at any point in history. Right. Probably they did. Like, my dad's big into genealogy, and there's a lot of Western English in there. So
sure, but it's all It's they're working in a closed environment, and they're I get it.
The point of the story is this whole notion of my blood is purely German or whatever is fucking bullshit.
Everybody has something in the woodpile. Like, there's no way.
It makes me crazy. It is absolute fucking bullshit. So just take that. I know we're going back quite a ways. Take that and just dump it. Yep. And this whole notion from Stephen McNellan is bullshit. Take that and dump it. Okay, so last couple of modern history things. Northwest Territorial Imperative. So if you were not aware, Oregon, when it entered the Union as a state, in its constitution said, if you want to live here, you have to be white. And
I know. So as a Oregonian native, it still just kills me that was in our it's awful. And it wasn't taken out of the wording until, like, not long ago. It's embarrassing how long that was still in the wording. But you had to be white if you wanted to live in Oregon.
I mean, so I guess be happy that you're not Alabama, where it's still in the Constitution that schools will be segregated.
It's true.
So, like, that's still on the law books.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's superseded by federal law, but if that federal law is ever successfully challenged, which it won't be, whatever it is,
but it's because that's still on the books.
Right. So anyway, Territorial Northwest Imperative said, look, there's already a lot of white people living in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, and Wyoming, I think. Let's just encourage white migration to those areas and set up like a white ethno state in the Pacific Northwest. And there's a lot of crossover here between ecofascism, which is totally a thing, between this whole notion that we see in the earlier Nazi and pre-Nazi ideas, that, like, that whole folkish idea of coming back to the soil, that is all tied up in this, right? So the militia movement, there's this whole history of Whidbey Island as a resting or a like hiding place for various militias. Like, it is surprising how frequently when you're reading about this, the Whidbey Island shows up. I've never been to Whidbey Island. The pictures look lovely. I probably won't go at this point, just but I'm sure it's
lovely now.
So you have just like, there's today, right? This is all happening today. There's it's not the order, it's the other one, the branch or something like that. Anyway, there's a current neo-fascist or fascist movement that's trying to set up again. The whole Northwest Imperative is still a thing that people are trying to achieve. It's a whole moment. On the other side of this, not other side of the spectrum, on a different side of this multi-angled thing of spaghetti, right? Bowl of spaghetti. You have these people who are inheriting the ideas of Ariosophy and trying to, they start to merge Ariosophy and this with Satanism in the 70s, right? Like you have Crowley and LaVey and all that kind of stuff, right? So now you have the joining of Crowley and LaVey with Ariosophy and like all the stuff that was coming out of San Francisco at one point. That was LaVey, right? Like that's where he had his headquarters, or was that Crowley?
I don't know. I don't know enough about San Francisco history.
It's one of the two had this big headquarters in San Francisco. And this is, by the way, not the Satanism of the modern satanic.
It's not the Satanic Church of America.
Yes, this is the other Satanism.
The other, right.
This isn't the one that's like, we're going to fight for your religious liberties by basically making everything a satanic rite so that you can do your thing. Anyway, so they start mixing this stuff. You get into this whole LaVey. It's LaVey. Thank you, Fleta. You're just, I love you so much. I miss you.
Yes.
Point of the story is that you start to see these two things get mixed up. You get into this, there's this whole temple of Set, which, among other things, start to worship Loki and Surtur as like aspects of the devil. So they're like, look, you couldn't have Ragnarok, which is Ragnarok, for folks who are unaware, right? It's the twilight of the gods, it's the end of the gods, but it's also the rise of sort of the new gods, right? So it's like a refreshing, it's a renaissance of the rebirth in the Norse mythology. So you have that stuff all gets mixed up. So you've got the Ariosophy, you've got that Norse sauce all over it, all over Satanism. And they introduced this whole thing called the Order of the Trapezoid, which I did not write big notes about, but the Order of the Trapezoid. Guys, go with me here. Not the coolest name that you could have come up with.
Really? I mean, you couldn't think of anything. The Order of the Trapezoid? Seriously?
So feel free to all join me in laughing at the Order of the Trapezoid, because I mean, I've been laughing at all these people because they're all idiots. The Order of the Trapezoid is just like the cherry
on top of your Norse sauced spaghetti bowl. That's what. Right. This sounds terrible.
So then we've got ecofascism. I mentioned that already. You've got that's folding in all that folkish idea about, we need to preserve the earth. Good. For future generations. Bad. So,
like, I'm okay. I fully support in preserving the earth, and this is the only planet we get. We should take care of it, but I want it for everybody, not just my descendants. And my descendant maybe wouldn't be able to do that because she's half Greek. So,
Yeah. So it's all of this stuff gets this is all just this humongously tangled web.
It is.
So we're going to set it aside and move on to another humongously tangled web.
Oh God, you're killing me, Claire.
Why not? Let us move into religious bullshit. And we're going to skip through this pretty quickly because
I think we just need to do a whole other show on religious bullshit aspect.
I'm going to skip over the highlights here. We're going to hit the highlights. We're going to skip some of the dumb stuff.
Let's not dig in because we'll be here all day and I have a writing lesson at 2.
Okay. So race is religion. You see the two major movements are Arian Christianity and heathenism. Arian Christianity, please note, this is not Aryan Christianity, which was an actual religion practiced by ancient Germanic peoples. This is the Christianity adopted by the Goths. It's what's termed Arian Christianity after the Bishop Arius. It's spelled Arian instead of Aryan. So the bad kind of Arian Christianity is a perversion of Christianity whereby essentially Arians are considered the inheritors and sometimes the descendants of Christ. So Christ is no longer the son of Jewish people in the Middle East. Now he's blonde-haired and blue-eyed, right? And they're like the anti-Semitism is strong and all of this, but it is very strong here. Obviously, though, this was too Jewish for some of these people, so they had to revert to an ethnic religion, and this is where we get heathenism. So, this is not a broad brush statement about all people who practice a form of Reconstructionist Germanic paganism, Asatru, or any of its cousins. I'm not saying you are all bad people.
Not at all. Not at all. just have to tread lightly and be very, very clear and specific on what you are doing and following.
And you got to be aware of the origins, right? Just like Christians need to be aware of the actions Christians took in the Middle Ages to
get to where
people. Yep. And why talking about the Crusades in a super happy, excited light when you are president of the United States and talking about a war in the Middle East is a very bad idea.
Bad.
So heathenism, the first major figure you need to know is this woman, Elsie Christensen. She is considered sometimes the godmother or grandmother of heathenism in America. She was from Denmark. She was a Nazi sympathizer. She gets kind of caught up in all this stuff, moves to America, the United States, and eventually to Canada. Post-war, picks up these ideas from an Australian guy, Rudd Mills, another National Socialist, mostly active in the 20s to 50s, who believed that Nordics founded Sumeria, Egypt, Persia, Greece, and Rome, because he had never read a history book or
been there or
right. Like, so he comes up with this weird idea. Elsie Christensen picks it up. She founds the Odinist Fellowship in 1969. This is more political and racial, with very strong National Socialist influences. She was in Europe during World War II, and she was one of those people who saw the Nazis and went, seems cool.
Seems cool. Great idea. I'm going to let you keep talking. I have to step out for half a second.
Yep, go. Okay, so she believed that the West was facing cultural demise and that the only cure was a revival of Norse paganism. Now, that phrase, cultural demise or cultural conflict, is a phrase that you will hear frequently repeated by people like Tucker Carlson, who then goes, I'm not a white supremacist, except for clearly, my guy, you are a something. So she has this idea that Norse paganism is the cure. And this is one of her quotes. The role of Odinism is clear. The pathogens must be destroyed and healthy organisms raised to serve the purpose of Aryan spiritual liberation and all-around advancement. That is one of the most disgusting sentences I have read in recent weeks. And I have been reading a lot of really difficult material to prepare for this episode. So you have the dehumanization of others, the pathogens, right? Like, you have healthy organisms, whatever the fuck that means. This is just, and then Aryan spiritual liberation. We're back to the whole idea of Aryan, which we have discussed at the very top of this episode, is a bad term. It is Next figure, Stephen McAllen. We've already talked about him. He was an American guy. He founded the Viking Brotherhood and the Asatru Free Assembly, which became the Asatru Free Assembly. He founded that in 1969, 1970. He sought an ethnic definition or ethnic interpretation, though he is still a screaming racist. Please do not confuse yourself on that topic, even though he kept saying, well, it is the religion of our people. Once you start talking about the religion of our people, we get into very murky waters. Somebody that we kind of didn't talk about, but the person who's filling in a lot of the stuff in sort of this Ariosophian movement, all that kind of stuff, Carl Jung. Carl Jung has a lot to answer for. So when all these people are like, I discerned, the missing pieces of this stuff that isn't entirely discussed in the historical record, what they are largely basing that on is Carl Jung's notions of sort of a folk consciousness, a communal memory. And he writes this whole essay on Wotanism, which is not frequently discussed anymore when people talk about Carl Jung, because they don't want to acknowledge the fact that the man was unpleasant. Yeah. And how much of all of this is his fault, I don't know. But he comes up with this whole like ancestral memory moment that is then like used to justify. They're like, well, I just know this based on. It's all just, yeah. It is a whole thing. Real quick, gender related bullshit. You've got what is Claire's problem with tradcore / cottagecore / trad life? It is a vision of once again, we are romanticizing the past in such a way that it's this like, you got to be the perfect wife. A lot of that is built on this, going back to these notions of like gender in the Middle Ages and gender in Viking Age society. Obviously, they don't know a lot about gender in Viking Age society, so they're just making shit up. If you have a super manly man, the only partner for a super manly man has to be a feminine woman who is guardian of hearth and home, and how do you have lots of little white babies, is just, this is all about milieu, right? Then you have the sort of opposite version of that motif, the Valkyrie. Ooh, like I said, we're skipping over a lot of this in at high speed, but basically and then you have hardcore masculinity, back to the whole muscular Christianity, rise of masculinity in the 19th century. This is all tied up with all of that. And by the way, when you're looking at your cute cottagecore Pinterest boards, please note the fact that 90% of the pictures that you look at feature white women, and there's a reason for that. So that is something to be aware of as you are pinning things. Last topic I want to hit before Ula talks about symbols is language bullshit. Again, we're going to skip over this pretty quickly. In my experience, language bullshit tends to be more an issue in England and English-speaking countries than in Scandinavia. But I don't have a lot of experience or exposure to Scandinavian language stuff, like historical Scandinavian languages. Yes, modern Scandinavian language discussions, not so much. What is linguistic purism? Linguistic purism is this notion that languages should remain pure. So you want a great example of this, look to the French and the Les Immortals and the Académie Française, and how they're constantly like, you cannot have this English word in our French language. It has to remain pure, right? So they are doing this through governmental action. English, we have this whole, like, there's been this movement, and this movement goes back to the 14th century. Like, there's a great example from the 14th century. There's a Kentish book that translates as a prick of conscience, which I think is hilarious because I'm 12, that goes out of its way to create calques, which is a literal translation of a foreign word, or a word in a foreign language, excuse me, to render this French original, Somme le Roi, into 14th century English. One translator or commentator on it in 1907, this woman, Clara Thompson, says it was rendered from the French original, one supposes by a very incompetent translator. But it's very interesting when you connect, like when you compare this 14th century example to other 14th century English works, it is very clearly focused more on, like it very clearly attempts to be closer to Old English than it does to Middle English. Like it's very interesting. Linguistically, it's very interesting. There's a modern movement today called Anglish, which is basically trying to remove foreign influence on the English language and go back to a purer version of English. And this is something that this is not something that people get excited about unless there's like an underlying better than assumption. English is not better than or worse than any other language. Brief linguistics moment. No one language is
better or worse than, and they're all an amalgamation of everything that they've come in contact with.
Their language, right? Language is language, and it's all exciting and beautiful. And this is where I run into a problem with being excited about language on Facebook. So I have liked all these different linguistic groups on Facebook. A lot of them are like Germanic memes for vowel alternating teens, right? Like there's a clear focus of my interest.
Nerd.
And so Facebook, in its infinite wisdom, does what all social media does. And it says, I wonder if you're excited about this, you must also be excited about that. So I have to go through on a regular basis and clear out, I do not like far right politics. I do not like, because it associates, because other people have made this association in their Facebook.
Therefore, if they liked it, you're going to like it. Yep. Right. Welcome to algorithms.
Yep. So Bradley, I do want to comment on what you said. You said this isn't inherently bad. There's the attempts to keep the dying Gaelic language alive. So this is different than preserving a dying or endangered language.
Right.
There is absolutely nothing wrong with linguistic or language preservation. I am not arguing against that. What I am saying is, when you have a modern language that is, especially one like English, that is certainly not endangered, and then you start saying, well, English is better without the foreign influence, that's where we start to see a problem. Yep. Right. And that's really, and the people who really champion things like English tend to be members, like you tend to see a cross-pollination of membership in those groups, and like the English for the English, or England for the English, and stuff like that. People who are like, things start to get real tricky there. So that is something I think that we can talk about more fully in the future. But with 15 minutes left until we hit 2 hours, let's take it away.
All right, I'm going to jump briefly onto symbols. and runes and symbols. And I've got a couple of, let's see if I can do this right. Ha! Y'all can see that. So here are some Norse early symbols and runes that have been co-opted by neo-Nazis. Some of these you're going to recognize pretty clearly. We have the Tree of Life, the Thor's Hammer, a Triskelion, Raven, there's a gajillion different versions of crosses. I just grabbed one of those. Obviously, like the Iron Cross is very well known. And we've got a Walking Winds Sona down symbol here. And that's as close as I'm going to get to a swastika. So this is just some of the more commonly known things that have been co-opted by assholes. But then you start to get into some of the more obscure things. So the Othala rune was used by 2 different Waffen SS divisions as divisional insignia, most recently used, and you probably have seen this, as the stage design for the right-wing conservative political action conference just like 3 weeks ago. And it, was everywhere. And it is so crazy to me. I mean, you could clearly see where they were headed there. But it's got its basis in Germanic runes. The life rune, again, used for an SS project, the Lebensbjorn project, which encouraged troopers to have children out of wedlock with Aryan women and kidnap children of Aryan appearance, and is currently used as part of the logo for the fucking National Alliance. So it's a group that is harkens on this stealing children and basically raping Aryan women. The Tyr rune was used by Hitler's brown shirts and Hitler's leadership school, and also another SS infantry division. And it's currently used as a kind of a warrior rune by neo-Nazis, modern neo-Nazis. I guess that's kind of a dichotomy there. And that is, you're going to see that Tyr rune on people that are more militant about their white supremacy. Here we have the Vulcansengel, or the wolf, the wolf angle, wolf logo. It was used by, again, several different Waffen units, including the Panzer Division. That's a big favorite of everybody. It's incorporated into the Aryan Nations logo, and it's often used as a lone wolf designator. So these are your using quotes, and y'all can't see me. Your lone wolf, your what is the word that I'm looking for? It's guys, I can't get none.
Incel.
Incel. Thank you. Incel. I knew it was there somewhere. The Gera rune was used by the German Ultranationalist Party, which was a predecessor to the Nazi Party. And it's currently used kind of as a replacement for the more well-known swastika, because most people recognize a swastika is bad. They see it, they're like, oh, that's a bad dude. The Gera rune has some of the same shape similarities, and it's kind of used modernly to replace the swastika, as it's a little bit on the down low there, in theory. And the Vulcanut. So this is an interesting one, because it is currently used often by racist Odinists as a symbol that they'll give their life in battle, theoretically, to Odin. But it's also being used in the LGBTQ environs as a symbol for both, I think this is where I need bear, both transsexuality and all the different spectrums of queerness. So that is an interesting one, because I've seen both white supremacists and queer people with that as like a tattoo. So this is not to say that we can't use any of these symbols, or that they're inherently bad, but just think about this. If you're going to use some of these symbols, kind of think about the possible impact. Like, we don't. What the swastika, for example, I mean, I'm sure everybody has heard about Trimgate, and it was a beautiful piece of amazing tablet woven trim that was a perfect historic, reproduction of an extant piece. But modernly it has issues, it has problems, and then that just went completely, crazy there. But anyway, so those are just a couple of symbols modernly used by white supremacists, white nationalists, that have their basis in Old Germanic or Old Norse symbols. And I would just caution people to kind of keep that in mind when you're using those symbols. If you are, talking about it, coming from the Pacific Northwest, I can tell you that when I travel back there, I look carefully. If I see somebody walking around with a big old chunky Thor's hammer, and half the time they bought it online from somebody I know, like they bought it from one of my friends. But then I look at the tattoos and I look at, like, you have to really look at, don't just walk up to somebody that's wearing a Thor's hammer and say, oh, cool, you must, be an awesome person, because they may not be an awesome person. I guess it's kind of where I'm headed there.
One of the, again, like talking about people who, like, one of the problems with these groups is that they don't actually do research and all that kind of stuff, is the Volknut is a particularly interesting example, because it is actually, there's a lot of debate around it. It's not, if whatever it is, Volknut is probably not what we're imagining it to be. Like, what we assign it to today is probably not what it was understood to be in period. Right. There are examples that design and art appears in Viking Age art, but is not labeled at any point. So people have made an assumption that this must be the Volknut, but right. there's no, like, once you dig into why they made that assumption, things come off the rails in a hurry, right? Yeah. So, and there may actually, it may be a series of interrelated symbols, exactly. And it may not have the meaning that people think it means, right? Like, right. Ultimately, it could have to do with a horse cult. It could have to do with another, like any sort of stuff. Like, it could be a number of other meanings. We don't know, because they didn't write it down. So right. It gets real complicated real quickly. There's a very, very, very good German book on this subject. Is published in 2012, and it's in English. The translation is Volknut, the triangle symbol of the Viking Age. Unfortunately, it's not available in English translation, so it didn't really get a lot of press when it was published in the English world, but English-speaking world. But it is something to be aware of, right?
And Greta, you're absolutely right. We can't assume that someone is a Nazi or neo-Nazi white supremacists because they are using one of these symbols or have a tattoo or something. But we also can't necessarily assume that they're all historic nerds like we are, right? Like, it's just a tread cautiously sort of situation, right?
Well, and it's the same thing with people. Like, if you want to get these symbols tattooed on your body, like, you need to be aware of, how they're understood in the modern age. Yep. And like, the meaning, you cannot control what other people will decide about something that they see.
Yes.
Right? Like, that is something to be incredibly aware of, especially as members of the SCA. Jean, I'm hoping I'm saying that. Is that Jean? I'm hoping that's right.
Jeannie, yeah.
Jeannie. Okay. So Jeannie, you're absolutely correct. There is a lot of swastikas on Anglo-Saxon burial urns. It is a very common emblem in early Germanic art.
It's a common emblem. Like, I should have grabbed it. There's a great graphic that I found. It is the walking winds. The swastika is common in American Indian, in East Indian, right. in Thai, it's a very common symbol across the globe.
It is an easy symbol to draw.
Yep.
It looks kind of cool, so it very rapidly becomes a very neat.
It's in Australian Aboriginal art. Like, it's everywhere because it is a cool symbol.
Right. Yeah. But like, so here's an example from my life, right? I have a kit that is a soft kit that is a Frankish impression. So I was looking at 6th and 7th century Frankish women in sort of the western part. So it's like this long coat over a long tunic. And then one of the hallmarks that is very, very common is there's this metal disc that hangs from the belts that is largely or exclusively symbolic. It's just it's a symbol, right? Later Frankish period, it becomes like a horse, a man riding a horse. But early, it's a lot of just sort of geometric art, and very, very frequently it involves a swastika. And when I went looking for a piece to be part of my kit, I made a very, very definite choice to find one that did not look like it could at all be interpreted as any kind of swastika. So mine has like a square, and then it's got lines connecting the square to the circle ring, right? And it functions, by the way, very well as a bottle opener. But that's not the point. The point is I cannot control when somebody sees me. If I'm in a store in kit and somebody sees me, I cannot control the assumptions that they will make about me. So I need to make decisions that based on that knowledge. And sometimes that decision can be like, this is going to be weird, and they might come up and talk to me about it or ask me about it. Cool. But the weird tends to be like when I'm wearing my full Germans with the hat and the collar and everything. People do tend to come up and be like, "What are you dressed as?" Right. But I make very elective choice to say, look, I do not want to be confused. Somebody who believes in, I don't want to be confused for a white supremacist. I don't want to be confused for a white nationalist. I don't want to be confused for a neo-Nazi. I don't want to be confused for any of that. So I'm going to electively choose to not have any kind of emblem like that, even if it is more historically correct.
I totally agree. So, this was a hill that I will admit that in my youth, in my 20s and even 30s, I'm like, this is a historic, documented symbol. Let's use it. Let's take away its power, its bad power. And then it took, I'll fully admit, I was one of them. It took me a while to really get how impactful it is. And it's exactly that. It's, I can control how I feel and interpret something, but I cannot control how someone else feels and interprets something. So, and if they see it as a bad thing, then, or a good thing, if they have that bent, then I can't control that. So what I can do is just remove that symbol from the language, as it were, right? So that I just don't, that doesn't even become an issue. And it took a long time for me to do that, because I wanted to be able to do historic, documentable, like extant, we know this happened, right? Probably took me 20 years to get off that high horse.
I think I speak for both of us when I say we also want to be respectful of our friends for whom that symbol is directly tied to an incredibly traumatic period in their history. It could be directly tied to the death of family members. Like, just because I am really excited about historical accuracy, I want to make sure that my historical accuracy does not also present something that one of my friends is going to see and be like, that's a traumatic memory that is like I don't want to be the cause of harm in somebody else.
Exactly. And it's an easy thing to eliminate from our, I mean, not lexicon, but our person, right?
Our graphical lexicon, or symbolic lexicon, right?
Symbolic
lexicon is a very good term. But anyway, we've been going for just over 2 hours.
Woo!
We could obviously keep going a lot, but Ula's got a writing lesson. I've got, unfortunately, to clean a bathroom, which is not as exciting, but
not nearly as exciting. I'm going to have a lot more fun on Ronaldo than you're going to have in your bathroom.
But we are taking a 2-week break, and then we will be back with a topic to be announced, because we were not that on top of it. So we're taking 2 weeks to do chores. And dig. At least I'm digging out of the winter. Ula's apparently enjoying 73 degrees and blue skies.
I am. I'm going to be planting plants and getting ready for my bees.
Fine then, I guess. But it was lovely to see you all. I hope you enjoyed this episode. We've got our bibliography available on the slide that'll pop up here in a second. And thank you.
We will see you all on the, what did we just say? The 17th. All right. Have a great day, everybody.